October the 30th, 1956. The Suez Crisis is underway. The Egyptian government has seized the Suez Canal, threatening European access to oil shipments from the Middle East. Britain, France, and Israel collude to attack Egypt and recapture the canal. Israeli forces have invaded the Sinai Peninsula and are in combat with the Egyptian army. British and French forces were now making ready for their part of the operation, a combined assault on the canal. To enable an amphibious landing and rapidly overwhelm Egyptian forces, it was critical to achieve air superiority. Large numbers of Anglo-French bombers, fighter bombers, fighters, and transport aircraft were therefore deployed to RAF air bases in Cyprus and Malta. Furthermore, the British deployed 3 aircraft carriers and 2 light aircraft carriers to the Mediterranean, while the French provided 2 aircraft carriers. Allied forces had some 750 aircraft in total. Aerial bombing began on the night of October the 31st, with medium and high altitude bombers from Cyprus and Malta striking Egyptian air bases near Cairo and along the Suez Canal. However, these night bombing attacks were inaccurate and only inflicted minor damage. The night bombing raids were followed by lower altitude daytime strikes. Fighter bombers operating from Cyprus and the Allied carrier force once again struck Egyptian airfields in the Canal Zone, near Cairo and at Alexandria. In daylight, their rocket and bomb attacks were much more effective and destroyed or disabled some 200 Egyptian aircraft. This was most of the Egyptian Air Force's total strength, meaning that it was now essentially destroyed. The Allies now had air supremacy, which meant they could go ahead with the amphibious assault. Royal Marine Commandos therefore left Malta on board transport ships, accompanied by 2 light carriers and escort ships. Allied paratroop forces on Cyprus were also made ready for their role in the assault. Over the next 100 hours, Allied aircraft continued to attack Egyptian military and logistical targets, so as to minimize resistance against the landing forces. Vehicle depots, military barracks, and the rail system were all targeted, so as to prevent troop movements reinforcing the canal zone. They also joined the Israeli Air Force in providing close air support to the Israeli army in Sinai. By early morning on the 5th of November, Israeli forces had achieved all their operational objectives, taking control of the Sinai Peninsula and forcing the Egyptian army to retreat towards the Suez Canal. At the same time, Allied paratroops were en route to the mouth of the Suez Canal at Port Said. Their role was to capture and hold strategic objectives in Port Said ahead of the landing forces' arrival. The British 3rd Parachute Battalion were tasked to capture El Gamil airfield to the northwest of Port Said, then move into the city and take over the main harbour complex. These logistical facilities would provide Allied supply and transport aircraft a landing area and also enable transport vehicles and armour to be brought directly on shore at the port. The initial drop went according to plan, with 3 para meeting light resistance and securing the airfield with only minor casualties. As they moved into the city, however, their advance was slowed down by Egyptian defenders who had set up strong points around the city cemetery. Pitched battle ensued, with Egyptian defenders holding their positions until afternoon, when carrier-based aircraft attacked them with rocket and bomb strikes. By now, 3 para were running low on ammunition and halted their advance, just 2.5 miles away from Port Said harbour. By contrast, French paratroopers had been more successful. The 2nd Colonial Parachute Regiment were dropped at Raswa, 10 miles to the southeast. Their goal was to secure at least one of the two bridges into Port Said. Without these routes, Port Said would become a dead end, and Allied forces could not advance south along the canal. Elements of 2 RPC engaged Egyptian forces in battle and managed to capture the western Raswa bridge. However, the eastern bridge was heavily damaged in the fighting and rendered unusable. At Raswa, 2 RPC also targeted the municipal waterworks, which Port Said depended on for its water supply. Taking control of this facility meant that the Allies had leverage to use against the city in case of negotiations. By mid-morning, the waterworks were in French hands. This was followed by further paradrops on the eastern side of the canal, at Port Fouad, from the French 1st Foreign Parachute Regiment. Fierce assaults by French paratroops and close air support enabled the French to capture Port Fouad by late afternoon on the 5th of November. The Allied command now demanded that Egypt surrender Port Said and granted a ceasefire until 10:30 p.m. If Port Said surrendered, an amphibious assault would no longer be necessary. However, the Egyptians rejected these terms. Early in the morning, on the 6th of November, the British landing force, which had left Malta 6 days ago, made ready for their assault. As the 40 and 42nd Commando Battalions, Royal Marines, entered their landing craft half a mile from Port Said beach, Allied ground attack planes strafed Egyptian positions. Escort destroyers barraged the landing zones, knocking out Egyptian defensive emplacements, but also causing damage and fires within the city. Following this, 40 and 42 Commando stormed the beach at Port Said at 7 a.m. and started to establish a bridgehead into the city. 42 Commando fought their way through the city, clearing Egyptian strongpoints on the way to Raswa and the French 2 RPC. 40 Commando made their way down the waterline, securing the fishing harbour, where tanks from the 6th Royal Tank Regiment were then brought ashore. However, they met heavy resistance at the main harbour, where Egyptian forces had set up a number of defensive strongpoints. While 40 Commando and elements of the 6th Royal Tank Regiment engaged the Egyptian defences, other tanks made their way south, linking up with 42 Commando and the 2nd RPC by mid-afternoon. Allied forces then slowly advanced southwards along the canal. In the meantime, global political developments were also underway. Intense pressure had been brought to bear upon the British government by the USA, the United Nations, and by domestic political opposition. War expenses and the restriction of oil supply due to the Suez Canal's closure had put Britain in a precarious financial position. The British government requested assistance from the IMF, but this was blocked by the United States. In fact, the American government threatened to sell their pound sterling bonds and cause a devaluation of the pound. Saudi Arabia put in place an oil embargo against the UK and France, and the United States and other NATO members refused to supply them with oil either. The USSR also made threats of war in support of their Egyptian allies. The British government therefore accepted a ceasefire without consulting the French and the Israelis. The ceasefire came into effect at 2 a.m. on the 7th of November, leaving Allied forces unable to seize the entire Suez Canal as originally planned. A UN peacekeeping force was then dispatched to Egypt, separating the combatants in the Canal Zone and the Israelis from the Egyptians in Sinai. Dealing with international political pressure and the looming threat of a financial crisis, on the 3rd of December, the British government agreed to withdraw forces from Egypt unconditionally in exchange for American aid. Israel was also compelled to withdraw from the Sinai. France was outraged with America's interference and Britain's inability to resist international pressure, and decided that both were unreliable allies. The French government also decided to pursue their own nuclear weapons program as a result of this betrayal. While the Allies were successful on a military and tactical level, they miscalculated their position in world affairs. Britain and France were no longer superpowers capable of taking offensive action unilaterally, and would need to secure support from their allies and the international community. This strategic mistake prevented them from achieving their objectives and made the Suez misadventure a costly mistake.